Picture yourself miles away from the closest neighbor, at the end of a long winding road, where the trees seem to gather closer, thickening around an old house you've been told is the perfect retreat from the world. It stands there, timeless and still, wrapped in an unsettling quiet that clings to the air. You turn the key, step inside, and close the door, listening as it clicks shut behind you, a sound that seems to linger longer than it should. In the silence, you feel it, a tension so subtle it's almost a whisper, a weight that settles around you, watching. As you wander through the empty rooms, you begin to notice the way shadows stretch along the walls and the way the floor creaks as if adjusting to your presence. Hallways twist and stretch deeper into the house, revealing dimly lit corners and doorways leading to rooms that weren't on the floor plan. The air grows heavy, thick with something invisible, something that presses closer as you move, as if each step is drawing you deeper into the heart of a place that doesn't want you to leave. Imagine glancing over your shoulder, the feeling that eyes are on you, always a step behind, just out of sight. And as the light fades, the house seems to come alive, responding to your presence. A chill drifts through, an unnatural draft whispers through locked doors. When you reach for a handle, it refuses to turn, as if the house itself is sealing you in. What would you do then, trapped in a place that seems to be breathing, watching, waiting? And you can't shake the feeling that you might not be alone after all? The house had always been a strange place. Its history was the kind of thing you heard in whispers, passed down through the locals in hushed tones. Some said it had once belonged to an older couple, the Whitakers, who kept to themselves, rarely seen but always there, watching from behind the curtains. That was until they mysteriously disappeared one winter, without a trace. No one really knew what had happened to them, but the house seemed to swallow the mystery whole. It remained vacant for years, and every now and then, someone would pass by and mention hearing strange sounds, something faint, like a lullaby drifting through the cracks in the windows. It wasn't long before rumors began to circle, footsteps on the stairs when no one was home, objects that would appear to have moved, and lights flickering in the dead of night. Eventually, the house was put up for sale. It wasn't long before it was snapped up by a couple from out of town, Jake and Sarah. They had big plans to turn it into a trendy Airbnb, promising guests a quiet getaway, isolated from the world. But Jake and Sarah, despite their enthusiasm for the listing, never seemed to actually visit the property themselves. They were always too busy with work or preoccupied with other commitments. Instead, they communicated with guests through text or email, offering only vague responses when asked about the oddities people sometimes noticed. Their policy was simple: we prefer not to visit the property ourselves. And so the house stood, silent, waiting for the next group of guests to step inside. 3 friends, Ethan, Emily, and Sarah, are eager for a weekend escape from the grind of everyday life. They found the listing online, drawn in by the promise of isolation and a relaxing retreat in the middle of nowhere. The price was right, and the reviews, though a little vague, seemed promising enough. Perfect for a quiet weekend, one of the reviews read. A beautiful, remote home, another had claimed. When they arrived, the house looked just as it did in the pictures, quaint, charming, and isolated. But as they unloaded their bags, they couldn't help but notice how old the place felt. None of them could identify the source of the faint rotting smell in the air. The decor was outdated, a hodgepodge of vintage furniture and patterned wallpaper that felt more like a time capsule than a home. As they explored, one of them, Emily, pointed out small scratches along the hallway walls, scratches so fine they almost looked intentional. But when they all stared at them, no one could say for sure. At first, they laughed it off. "It's an old house, right?" joked Ethan, the most skeptical of the group. "Probably just normal wear and tear." They settled into their rooms, trying to shake off the feeling that something was off. But that night, as darkness fell, the house seemed to come alive. It started small, a soft thud, like something heavy falling to the floor. They brushed it off, thinking it was just the house settling. But then the footsteps started. Faint at first, too faint to pinpoint exactly where they were coming from, but they were unmistakable. The friends froze, listening as the sounds grew louder, pacing down the hall, then back again. Footsteps, moving from one end of the hallway to the other. But when they dared to peer into the hall, no one was there. "Maybe it's just the house settling," said Emily, though her voice was strained. But the taps, that was harder to ignore. The taps from the kitchen, like someone running their fingers along the faucet, turning it on, then off. But no one had gone into the kitchen. Could be a leaky pipe, Ethan offered, but even he sounded uncertain. And then there are whispers. They were soft, barely audible, but it was enough to send a shiver down their spines. Faint voices in the dark, just on the edge of hearing, like they were coming from right behind them. "I'm not hearing that," Sarah said, shaking her head. But Emily and Ethan had heard it too. They all tried to brush it off and convince themselves it was just their nerves. They'd all seen too many horror movies. But something gnawed at them. That feeling of being watched, of being listened to. Then came the moment that changed everything. It happened when Emily and Ethan were standing in the hallway, debating whether to check the kitchen again or go back to their rooms. That's when they noticed it, a door, one that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a closet or a pantry, but a solid door, perfectly flush with the wall, the wood dark and worn. Although the house layout was odd, none of them had seen this door on their way in. And it wasn't on the floor plan Jake and Sarah had sent them. Ethan reached out to touch the handle. It was cold, unnaturally cold for a house that had been sealed up all day. He pulled, but the door didn't budge. "That's weird," Emily said, stepping forward. "There wasn't a door here before." They tried to shake it off. "Maybe it's a storage closet or something," Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. Even as they dismissed it, that cold feeling returned, that the house was watching them, waiting for them to act. Something was waiting behind that door, and they had no idea what it was. A sudden, sharp knock echoed from the other side. The sound rang out loud and clear, unmistakable, like someone was knocking from the inside. They froze. "Who's there?" Emily called out, but the knock came again, more insistent this time. The air grew thick, the temperature dropped sharply, and that sense of being trapped deepened. Something wasn't right. As night crept in once more, the friends couldn't shake the unease lingering from the previous night. The house felt different now, as if it had settled into their presence, watching every move they made. And it didn't take long before things started to get strange, stranger than before. It began when Sarah, who'd been rummaging around, stumbled upon an old, dusty closet. Inside, she found a series of journals, leather-bound with worn pages, tucked behind some shelves. She flipped one open, curiosity overcoming her caution, and froze as she read the entries, scrawled in frantic handwriting. The words spoke of doors that won't open, rooms that change, and faces in the mirror. Each entry grew more disturbing, a descent into paranoia from someone who'd felt trapped and watched. She shared the journals with the others, who read them in tense silence, each entry sending a chill down their spines. "Is this some kind of prank?" Ethan said, though he couldn't hide the tremor in his voice. The more they explored the house, the more disorienting it became. Rooms didn't connect as they should, certain doors seemed to lead to the same rooms, even when they turned down opposite hallways. At one point, Sarah tried to retrace her steps to the living room but found herself back in the same old closet. And when Emily opened the door to what she thought was the kitchen, she found herself staring into the hallway she'd just left. They were beginning to feel like rats in a maze, twisting around the same dark, unfamiliar paths, always ending up where they'd begun. The house seemed to shift, subtly but certainly, every time they turned their backs. Doors that should lead to freedom led only deeper into its suffocating corridors. In an attempt to break the unsettling monotony, Ethan decided he'd go out for groceries, hoping some fresh air might clear his head. But as he reached for the front door, he found it was locked tight. He looked closer, expecting to see a latch or deadbolt, but there was nothing, no keyhole, no lock, no visible way to secure it. The handle wouldn't turn, like something was blocking it. "Are you guys messing with me?" he called out, trying to sound casual, though his voice cracked just enough to betray him. But his friends, equally on edge, shook their heads, just as bewildered. Emily tried the back door, but it too wouldn't budge, as if glued shut. Every exit seemed mysteriously jammed. Even the windows were locked tight, refusing to give even a crack of air. The realization settled in like a heavy weight. The house was sealing them in. "Okay, this is getting too weird," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "How would you react if every house door locked from the outside? Would you keep looking for a way out or stay together and wait?" The friends huddled in the living room, trying to keep calm, but the tension was thick, every creak and groan of the house making their nerves stand on end. Emily suggested they stay together, certain that if they just kept a clear head, they'd figure a way out in the morning. The others felt like they had found something dark that was watching them and waiting for them to make a mistake. As midnight approached, the air grew heavy, thick with a presence they couldn't see. And then came a sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping from behind the walls, echoing through the house. It grew louder, like footsteps in perfect time, leading them further into the heart of the house that had now become their prison. They were trapped, and as the shadows deepened, it became clear that whatever lurked within this house had no intention of letting them go. As night dragged on, desperation set in. Ethan fumbled for his phone, hoping to call for help, but the screen displayed no signal. The Wi-Fi, which had worked fine earlier, now showed nothing but a blank bar, as if the entire house had fallen off the grid. They were alone, cut off, with no way to reach the outside world. That's when the voices started. Soft, almost indistinguishable at first, but unmistakably calling their names. A faint whisper, winding through the walls, drifting in and out like a song carried on the wind. Sarah heard it first, a voice that sounded like her own, coming from somewhere deep within the house. She tried to shake it off as nerves, but then Ethan heard his name too, soft, lingering in the air, followed by a giggle that was neither friendly nor human. Panicking, they huddled together in the hallway. "This isn't possible," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. But before he could finish, Emily's face went pale. She was staring up at the staircase, eyes wide, mouth open in shock. Do you see that?" she stammered. They all looked. There, at the top of the stairs, a shadowy figure stood, unmoving, watching them. Its face was shrouded in darkness, but they could feel its gaze piercing through them. Suddenly, it vanished, as if it had never existed. The silence that followed was broken by a slow, drawn-out creak. A door they hadn't noticed before, concealed at the end of the hall, was swinging open on its own, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into a dark, hidden basement. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, the friends hesitated, glancing at one another before they began their descent. Each step down seemed to echo endlessly. The basement air was growing colder with every step, thick with an odor of dampness and decay. The darkness was suffocating, the faint flickering of the lone light bulb casting long, jagged shadows along the walls. And then they heard it. A soft, eerie voice humming a haunting, unfamiliar tune, echoing from somewhere deeper in the basement. The sound was distant, yet close enough to send shivers down their spines. It was like a lullaby, old and mournful, filling the air with a twisted sense of familiarity that none of them could place. Shapes began to shift in the shadows, subtle movements that made the hairs on their necks prickle. The walls seemed to pulse as if alive, casting strange shadows that loomed closer as the humming grew louder. Panicked, Emily turned to run, scrambling back up the stairs, but the basement door had slammed shut behind them. She pounded on it, desperate, but it wouldn't budge. They tried every door they could find, but each one refused to open, trapping them deeper within the maze. Every window was unbreakable, every possible exit locked tight as if the house had come alive, determined to keep them inside. As the humming grew louder, almost overwhelming, they knew they had only two choices: keep looking for a way out, or face whatever horror was lurking in the dark. The walls seemed to close in, shadows growing longer, and as they felt the chilling presence move closer, the friends realized this house wasn't just haunted, it was a trap, and it had no intention of letting them escape. As they stumbled through the basement, their minds reeling from the horrors they had already witnessed, Emily noticed something on the floor. She crouched down, scraping away at the dust and grime beneath her fingers. There, carved into the wooden floor with jagged precision, was a message: "There is no escape. We are all part of the house now." The words seemed to pulse in the dim light, their meaning sinking in like a stone in water. Before they could process it, a sharp sound broke the silence. Click. The sound of a key turning in the front door. All four friends turned in unison, hope flaring for a brief moment. But as they rushed toward the door, eager for salvation, they found it wide open with no one in sight. The cold air rushed in, but the house was still, and the shadows in the hallway remained unmoving. They stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests. The key had turned, but no one was there. Panic took hold again. Sarah bolted toward the nearest window, throwing open the latch with all her strength. Glass shattered as she broke through, and the friends scrambled toward the gap, desperate for freedom. They tumbled out into the yard, gasping for air, the cool night welcoming them as if it were a new life. They ran, not looking back, but when they reached the edge of the property, they stopped. Looking back toward the house, they saw something that stopped their breath. In the upper windows, shadows moved, pacing back and forth, watching them. Faces that were not their own, but faces that felt hauntingly familiar. They stood motionless for a moment, gazing out at them with cold, empty eyes. And then, just as they began to turn away, a voice, faint but clear, whispered in the wind. "Come back soon." A chill ran through them all. They didn't stop running until the house was far behind, and the road ahead stretched open, free of the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on them. Would you ever dare to stay in a house with a history like this? Or do you think some places are better left alone? If this story gave you chills, hit like and share it with someone who loves a true horror story. You never know, maybe they'll be brave enough to spend the night in a house like this one. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of real-life terror. And we want to know, do you believe the house wanted them to stay forever, or was it all just in their heads? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.